File 35 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 4, Section 3 of the Ancient Philosophy. Several moralists have recommended it as an excellent method of becoming acquainted with our own hearts and knowing our progress in virtue, to recollect our dreams in a morning and examine them with the same rigor that we would our most serious and most deliberate actions. Our character is the same throughout, say they, and appears best where artifice, fear, and policy have no place, and men can neither be hypocrites with themselves nor others. The generosity or baseness of our temper, our meekness or cruelty, our courage or pusillanimity influence the fictions of the imagination with the most unbounded liberty, and discover themselves in the most glaring colors. In like manner, I am persuaded there might be several useful discoveries made from a criticism of the fictions of the ancient philosophy concerning substances and substantial forms, and accidents and occult qualities, which, however unreasonable and capricious, have a very intimate connection with the principles of human nature.
This could prove an interesting read, though I don't find it necessarily. If you're writing a treatise, I would say that you are not building, I don't think that I can argue that you shouldn't refer to other philosophers. But if you're only going to roast them, okay, then it's like, okay, you're using an implicit argument from their bad philosophy, so therefore I must be good philosophy. That's fallacious, right? And if there's nothing to bring to the table other than, sophistry and illusion, then why bring it in, right? So there's something, when in philosophy, when a philosopher brings in some other philosopher, it's either to say, they're bad philosophers, so therefore I must be good, right? Or they're usually cherry-picking particular stuff they like from other philosophers in order to convince you in sort of a, but it's not only me who says it, it's also, they also say it, so therefore I must be right? It's sort of, it is slightly sophist in nature, right? And it's sort of, he has an edge towards roasting other philosophers as incompetent, and it comes through between the lines, so to say, right? And this is probably a case of that. Okay, so that being said, right, I don't mind a few criticisms of other people's philosophy. And if you can point to the problems in their philosophy, so to say, right? Fine, I'm not, except that this is a treatise. So I would say that in a treatise, it has nothing, other people's philosophy has nothing to do here, because it's your treatise, right? And I know that a treatise has a sort of authoritarian air to it, right? A treatise. This is the laws of philosophy, right? So in itself, it is an appeal to an authority. It's hard to avoid thinking that, right? When you're calling something a treatise, it's, at least with modern ears, right? And it might be different back then, right? I think that treatise was a term that was often used, like inquiry or essay. These terms were used very much in, so they might not have this more profound, connotations as they have now back then. So, let's leave it there, right? But there was one word I was like, what the? Our courage or pusillanimity, pusillanimity. I had to admit, I have never heard that one before, right? So it's also like, okay, the average reader, right? Pusillanimity. Okay.
It is confessed by the most judicious philosophers that our ideas of bodies are nothing but collections formed by the mind of the ideas of the several distinct sensible qualities of which objects are composed, and which we find to have a constant union with each other. But however these qualities may in themselves be entirely distinct, it is certain we commonly regard the compound which they form as one thing, and as continuing the same under very considerable alterations. The acknowledged composition is evidently contrary to this supposed simplicity, and the variation to the identity. It may, therefore, be worthwhile to consider the causes which make us almost universally fall into such evident contradictions, as well as the means by which we endeavor to conceal them. It is evident that as the ideas of the several distinct successive qualities of objects are united together by a very close relation, the mind, in looking along the succession, must be carried from one part of it to another by an easy transition, and will no more perceive the change than if it contemplated the same unchangeable object. This easy transition is the effect, or rather essence of relation, and as the imagination readily takes one idea for another where their influence on the mind is similar, hence it proceeds that any such succession of related qualities is readily considered as one continued object existing without any variation. The smooth and uninterrupted progress of the thought, being alike in both cases, readily deceives the mind, and makes us ascribe an identity to the changeable succession of connected qualities. But when we alter our...
You can talk about deception. This is what usually is called illusion nowadays in philosophy, I would think, right? Illusionism and so on. Well, something like it at least, right? That how would you get to a reference point where you can check whether or not your experience is correct, so to say, right? How would you be able to double check your experiences, whether or not you should, if you're experiencing elephant, right? Let's call that an experience, right? How would you know how would you get to whether or not you should or shouldn't experience that elephant? And in even worse cases where you're not experiencing elephant, can you tell whether you should experience elephant? Or is it correct that you are not experiencing elephant, right? Because it's more particular to say that's an elephant than saying there's no elephant, or that object is not an elephant, pointing to another object and saying that's not an elephant. There's an infinite number, basically, of things that a thing isn't, right? That beaver is not a car, that beaver is not a bicycle, that beaver is not a book, that beaver is not a whatever, right? And even worse, that you can point anywhere in space and say, there isn't an elephant, there isn't a car, there isn't a whatever, unless you're pointing to an object and saying that object isn't there, right? Then you're contradicting your experiences. So the mind can jump around with imagining things and propose things that aren't there, or proposed, which would be lying, right? Or negate things that they're actually being experienced. And all these, when you're communicating things, is an avenue to confusion about existence, right? And when you get, that's why you have to wind down or dribble down or reduce down to what is the basics of this, right? What is the basic, what is the kind of starting point that enables you to talk about anything or refer to anything, right? Because when you're philosophizing in this way, you're presenting your thinking about how you think, right? So when you do that, it's implied in your action, so to say, that you are communicating with some outside, right? If you didn't believe in that outside, you wouldn't probably write a book about what you're thinking about, right? So it's implicit in the way of writing a book that you're attempting to communicate. You could say maybe this is approaching a circular argument, maybe, and I might not disagree with you, right? But then you could probably say that unless you want to stay in solipsism, at some point you need to establish some kind of outside to direct your experience and constructed will towards, right? And obviously those who would claim that they are not doing that or rejecting free will or something like that, right? I don't know what they are attempting to do, but they are usually contradicting their own actions, because their actions from the outside looks like they're working from an idea where they have an impression and act towards it, right? If I'm going to judge my own experiences the same way. So what I'm trying to get at is it is a minefield of avenues where you can very quickly go down the wrong path, right? And you will never get back because you have left it behind. So the more ground floor the philosophy is, the more severe the flaws in the other end when you get to, like, you know, understanding of knowledge and ethics and morality and so on will possibly be, because you have in very foundational stuff you have gone astray, right? And it's so important that you get the first step right? The foundational starting point has to be perfect, right? If there's anything in philosophy that has to be perfect, or maybe not, perfection is sort of, it's not a good term. It has to be flawless, maybe I should say, right? Flawless is not necessarily perfection, right? Because perfection is something that is better than flawless, right? It's perfect. It cannot even be improved, right? Something that is flawless might be able to be improved to become perfect, right? So let's say flawless then. Your ground floor have to be flawless. It has to be impenetrably useful. It cannot be argued against. It's unarguably useful, right? So, and that might be a difficult exercise to get there, right? But it cannot be something that we have to argue how we understand. Because if we have to do that, there's something missing. Because it shouldn't be arguable. And if you can't get to something that isn't impenetrable to arguments, we will never be able to agree on philosophy. So I might be wrong that you can get to some point where there's an impenetrable reduction base. But if there isn't, we are never going to agree on any philosophy. You might agree with some, but there will never be, let's say, universal agreement. Because we cannot agree because we're arguing about it, right? And we will keep arguing. And then so be it, right? I mean, I'm not going to force anything on anybody that isn't there. So why am I rambling about this? I actually forgot my train of thought. Let's get back into...
Or a method of considering the succession, and instead of tracing it gradually through the successive points of time, survey at once any two distinct periods of its duration and compare the different conditions of the successive qualities. In that case, the variations which were insensible when they arose gradually do now appear of consequence and seem entirely to destroy the identity. By this means, there arises a kind of contrariety in our method of thinking, from the different points of view in which we survey the object, and from the nearness or remoteness of those instants of time which we compare together. When we gradually follow an object in its successive changes, the smooth progress of the thought makes us ascribe an identity to the succession, because it is by a similar act of the mind we consider an unchangeable object. When we compare its situation after a considerable change, the progress of the thought is broke, and consequently we are presented with the idea of diversity. In order to reconcile which contradictions, the imagination is apt to feign something unknown and invisible, which it supposes to continue the same under all these variations, and this unintelligible something it calls a substance, or original and first matter. We entertain a like notion with regard to the simplicity of substances and from like causes. Suppose an object perfectly simple and indivisible to be presented along with another object whose coexistent parts are connected together by a strong relation. It is evident the actions of the mind in considering these two objects are not very different. The imagination conceives the simple object at once with facility by a single effort of thought, without change or variation. The connection of parts in the compound object has almost the same effect, and so unites the object within itself that the fancy feels not the transition in passing from one part to another. Hence, the color, taste, figure, solidity, and other qualities combined in a peach or melon are conceived to form one thing, and that on account of their close relation, which makes them affect the thought in the same manner as if perfectly uncompounded. But the mind rests not here. Whenever it views the object in another light, it finds that all these qualities are different and distinguishable and separable from each other, which view of things being destructive of its primary and more natural notions obliges the imagination to feign an unknown something or original substance and matter as a principle of union or cohesion among these qualities, and as what may give the compound object a title to be called one thing, notwithstanding its diversity and composition.
I understand what I hear him talking about is the object, to use his term, is neither the same from a quality standpoint, from a quality observation, it is neither persistent in its constancy, right? It's broken up because we can't experience everything everywhere all the time, right? And yet we can still say it's the same thing, even if sort of, the colors, shades and shapes, and they are dynamic, right? And it's not a big mystery, in my opinion. It becomes a kind of mystery when, as I expect or suspect, Hume to work from a materialistic metaphysics, which is there is an outside where I can say something about those objects which are actually represented in my mind as objects or perceptions, right? And further down the line, ideas and relations and so on. As if my mind is trying to establish something about an external world that is approaching some kind of perfect one-to-one description or something like that. I'm not completely sure that his metaphysics is like this, but it sounds like it, right? So there is a certain limit where you can, when you're dealing with qualia and cognitions, right? If to my best understanding, you cannot say anything about why they are there. Why am I experiencing elephant? I have no freaking clue, right? I don't know if I should experience elephant. And I don't know why these particular colors, sounds and tastes and so on somehow is cognized as elephant, right? And I could argue, yeah, that's because I need to survive. No, that's not a good argument actually, right? Because that is just, it doesn't need to, well, why does it need to be like that rather than something else than that is there in order for me to survive? I never really liked the idea of explaining my experience from an evolutionary standpoint, although it might be something that could potentially be something that I don't have access to, that is sort of in that ballpark or something like that. But it doesn't really matter how it came to be, right? What matters is, how do I use it? Because I don't have any memories of how it came to be, right? So I can't base it on any kind of rationalization or history or anything like that. I usually can do when I have a memory of it, right? Because that which is before equality and cognition that can be a part or responsible for memories, that means I cannot have memory of that which comes before that which is responsible for creating memories, right? I need to have the impressions, but I can't explain, and then I can create some memory and evidence based on my impressions, but then I can't use that evidence to explain what comes before that impression that gives me evidence. Then it becomes a circular argument, right? So I would say you cannot argue. You can use it as a technical tool, maybe, to say, okay, I mean, you can play around with the thought, I guess, right? But it's not a knockdown argument. You cannot use evolution to explain experiences. I would say, exactly because if there's something that is before your experiences, you cannot explain it, because all explanations arrive from the fact that there is an impression, right? So you are stuck on the wrong side, you could say, of impressions if you want to explain that which comes before impressions. So you are shut off from whatever might be before impressions. And that means, of course, that if you say there are objects out there before you have an impression of them, you can say nothing about it, right? And if you can say nothing about it and you sort of retract from this inside-outside dichotomy for a while in order to get rid of that fallacious idea of an external object, in the sense of an object that I have an experience of, right? Then you say, well, why do I think there is an outside then, right? What is it that makes me say that? Is it just something I decided? Who told me? Did I tell myself? Is it just habitual thinking? Where does it come from, right? And to the best of my understanding, when I search myself, as Hume would say, something like that, survey myself, I can't find anything about my experiences that necessitates there must be an outside. It is only a habitual kind of interpretation of my experiences, right? It's only an interpretation. So if I have to, if I must establish an outside, there's only one way to do it, right? And it's a very limited access I have, which is basically I have no access. It's like how would I put this? You can go to the walls of, you can get to the Chinese walls of China, right? And you get to the wall, you can't go any further, right? You can say, yes, there is something beyond the wall. It's a bad analogy, but it's, just to illustrate, right? Because I'm using an experiential world in order to describe the limitation of experience. So it's a bad analogy, but how would you use an analogy to something you don't have access to, right? That you can go to the wall and say there is something beyond the wall, and the picture on the wall is a description of what might be out there, right? But then obviously the description on that wall is not that which is out there or beyond the wall, right? So this is sort of foundational metaphysics that is possibly radical skepticism, right? In a rejection of both idealism and materialism, right? So this kind of thinking, which I think is very, very rigid, right, is I'm pretty much alone, I think, in this kind of thinking, because either people saying, these people talking about a world that you can't get to, they're crazy, right? So they stay with their materialism and think that their experiences of a dog is actually the actual dog out there, though they have only an experience of it, right? Then there are those who reject materialism, say, no, I'm an idealist. Now I'm going to go out there beyond the wall, telling you what is beyond the wall, using descriptions I can only use on this side of the wall, right? Take any idealist you want, and please, if you find somebody who can actually describe something beyond their own experiences, how would they possibly describe that without going into some kind of analogy or metaphor? They're using terms that are used on this side of the wall, right? They are fabulating beyond what they can possibly have access to, right? So the only way to get to grips with you not being solipsist, yet still not fabulating about what is beyond your experiences. The only way to do that is to say, my experiences are representations of an external world I don't have access to. That's the ground floor, right? Okay. So I'm going a bit beyond Hume here, right? But these are maybe I'm not going beyond Hume because I'm just presenting my understanding of these particular aspects, right? But it sounds to me like he's trying to keep that external world as something that he has access to via perfect representations or one-to-one representations of objects outside. Because he has this perfect representation of an object inside, it's the same outside, right? So he's taking the inside and just, moving and placing it outside as if it's in the actual outside. That's problematic, right? And yet he still sounds skeptical about it, so I'm still confused about how he understands this, right? He has been going around circles with this, and I have a sense he's repeating himself, right? So I'm a little dumbfounded about his metaphysics, I must admit.
The peripatetic philosophy asserts the original matter to be perfectly homogeneous in all bodies, and considers fire, water, earth, and air as of the very same substance, on account of their gradual revolutions and changes into each other. At the same time, it assigns to each of these species of objects a distinct substantial form, which it supposes to be the source of all those different qualities they possess, and to be a new foundation of simplicity and identity to each particular species. All depends on our manner of viewing the objects. When we look along the insensible changes of bodies, we suppose all of them to be of the same substance or essence. When we consider their sensible differences, we attribute to each of them a substantial and essential difference. And in order to indulge ourselves in both these ways of considering our objects, we suppose all bodies to have at once a substance and a substantial form. The notion of accidents is an unavoidable consequence of this method of thinking with regard to substances and substantial forms. Nor can we forbear looking upon colors, sounds, tastes, figures, and other properties of bodies as existences which cannot subsist apart, but require a subject of inhesion to sustain and support them. For having never discovered any of these sensible qualities where, for the reasons above mentioned, we did not likewise fancy a substance to exist, the same habit which makes us infer a connection betwixt cause and effect makes us here infer a dependence of every quality on the unknown substance. The custom of imagining a dependence has the same effect as the custom of observing it would have. This conceit, however, is no more reasonable than any of the foregoing. Every quality, being a distinct thing from another, may be conceived to exist apart, and may exist apart not only from every other quality, but from that unintelligible chimera of a substance. But these philosophers carry their fictions still farther in their sentiments concerning occult qualities, and both suppose a substance supporting which they do not understand, and an accident supported of which they have as imperfect an idea. The whole system, therefore, is entirely incomprehensible, and yet is derived from principles as natural as any of these above explained. In considering this subject, we may observe a gradation of three opinions that rise above each other according as the persons who form them acquire new degrees of reason and knowledge. These opinions are that of the vulgar, that of a false philosophy, and that of the true, where we shall find upon inquiry that the true philosophy approaches nearer to the sentiments of the vulgar than to those of a mistaken knowledge. It is natural for men in their common and careless way of thinking to imagine they perceive a connection betwixt such objects as they have constantly found united together, and because custom has rendered it difficult to separate the ideas, they are apt to fancy such a separation to be in itself impossible and absurd. But philosophers who abstract from the effects of custom and compare the ideas of objects immediately perceive the falsehood of these vulgar sentiments, and discover that there is no known connection among objects. Every different object appears to them entirely distinct and separate, and they perceive that it is not from a view of the nature and qualities of objects we infer one from another, but only when in several instances we observe them to have been constantly conjoined. But these philosophers, instead of drawing a just inference from this observation and concluding that we have no idea of power or agency separate from the mind and belonging to causes, I say, instead of drawing this conclusion, they frequently search for the qualities in which this agency consists, and are displeased with every system which their reason suggests to them in order to explain it. They have sufficient force of genius to free them from the vulgar error that there is a natural and perceivable connection betwixt the several sensible qualities and actions of matter, but not sufficient to keep them from ever seeking for this connection in matter or causes. Had they fallen upon the just conclusion, they would have returned back to the situation of the vulgar, and would have regarded all these disquisitions with indolence and indifference. At present, they seem to be in a very lamentable condition, and such as the poets have given us but a faint notion of in their descriptions of the punishment of Sisyphus and Tantalus. For what can be imagined more tormenting than to seek with eagerness what forever flies us, and seek for it in a place where it is impossible it can ever exist? But as nature seems to have observed a kind of justice and compensation in everything, she has not neglected philosophers more than the rest of the creation, but has reserved them a consolation amid all their disappointments and afflictions. This consolation principally consists in their invention of the words faculty and occult quality. For it being usual, after the frequent use of terms which are really significant and intelligible, to omit the idea which we would express by them, and to preserve only the custom by which we recall the idea at pleasure, so it naturally happens that after the frequent use of terms which are wholly insignificant and unintelligible, we fancy them to be on the same footing with the precedent, and to have a secret meaning which we might discover by reflection. The resemblance of their appearance deceives the mind as is usual, and makes us imagine a thorough resemblance and conformity. By this means, these philosophers set themselves at ease, and arrive at last, by an illusion, at the same indifference which the people attain by their stupidity, and true philosophers by their moderate skepticism. They need only say that any phenomenon which puzzles them arises from a faculty or an occult quality, and there is an end of all dispute and inquiry upon the matter. But among all the instances wherein the Peripatetics have shewn they were guided by every trivial propensity of the imagination, no one is more remarkable than their sympathies, antipathies, and horrors of a vacuum. There is a very remarkable inclination in human nature to bestow on external objects the same emotions which it observes in itself, and to find everywhere those ideas which are most present to it.
It's an interesting to bestow, but among let's stop there. But among all the instances wherein the Peripatetics, I don't understand that particular term, have shown they were guided by every trivial propensity of the imagination, no one is more remarkable than the sympathies, antipathies, and horrors of a vacuum. Now, vacuum is metaphorical here, right? That there is something, the idea that there would be something I can't explain gives a sorry, my voice, I'm in my puberty now, right? I'm late bloomer. Where was I going? That there's something I can't explain is not very good for most people in the world, right? Now, to get to the notion that there's something I cannot get to explain. There's something I can't explain, but I sort of should be able to explain is one thing, right? But that there's something I cannot possibly get to, and therefore can't explain, is even more, it is even worse for people, right? While I think that, well, it makes my philosophy easier, that, okay, yeah, I can't go there, so I don't need to explain it. So I maybe, reducing my philosophy to 25% of what other philosophers spent their hard-earned life on explaining, that ultimately is inexplicable or inaccessible, right? So from a efficiency standpoint, if there's something you can argue that you can't get to, be happy about it, because then you don't need to philosophize about it, right? But, I think this is something that stems from parenting, ultimately, right? A parent that is skeptical and doubtful fear that they can't instill solidity in their children. If you're a parent and you have to say, well, I don't know that, or you cannot possibly know that, you are instilling a kind of skepticism and ultimately philosophy in children, while parents generally want to say, it's because of this, it's because of that, it's because of this, and that's why all these weird stories about, the creation stories and God's there and taking care of this and taking care of that, and it's because Thor is, when there's a thunder, it's because Thor is driving his horse carriage or whatever the fuck it was, right? And it creates the sounds, and they create all sorts of stories to seem like they understand that which they cannot have access to, right? So that they will keep being treated as authorities by their children, basically so the parents can order their children around because parents are right, of course, right? So rather than a parent being sort of sufficiently skeptical or say, well, I don't know, right? And be strict about what you can actually claim to know. And what these kinds of appeals to authority, you could say, gets away with is they actually, because they don't know, they maybe unconsciously understand that other people won't know either or can't get to that knowledge. So by claiming knowledge about that which you cannot get to, you can inflict that on other people and create some kind of control by creating gods or, whatever, right? Governments or all sorts of shit that doesn't exist, right? But there's sort of some magical, whatever, ether out there somewhere, right? So I think that the lack of ability to say, I don't know, or even I cannot know because I don't have access to it, right? Nobody wants to do that. It's, as he says, it's a part of human psychology or something like that. I fucking hate these areas where you say, I can't know that, or saying, I don't know, right? So that's the kind of vacuum he is dealing with, as far as I can understand, right?
This inclination, it is true, is suppressed by a little reflection, and only takes place in children, poets, and the ancient philosophers. It appears in children by their desire of beating the stones which hurt them, in poets by their readiness to personify everything, and in the ancient philosophers by these fictions of sympathy and antipathy. We must pardon children because of their age, poets because they profess to follow implicitly the suggestions of their fancy. But what excuse shall we find to justify our philosophers in so signal a weakness? End of file 35.
Yeah. I can I have the same experience when my children were smaller, that they damned the whatever thing that annoyed them or hurt them slightly or whatever, right? That it was the fault of that stone that I fell, right? So, and it's like what's it called? Animate the world or reifying the world or something like that. I'm not sure. That giving it mental abilities, almost like panpsychism or something like that. I don't know, right? Okay, so what Hume actually gets a step into is something that possibly hasn't been, maybe some degree John Locke, right? But hasn't been sufficient, hasn't been a part of philosophy of old, right? Which is how your own psychology affects how you think. The idea of confirmation bias, right? Or wishful thinking, or an appeal to authority, right? And control, and all sorts of aspects that are not based in reasonings of any kind, maybe pretending to be in a sort of a sophist manner, but are basically just how your psychology is expressed through philosophy in order to give it an air of neutrality and authority, right? And that's an important aspect of philosophers, and he sort of points to that, and I like that, right? It's very prevalent, and it's still very prevalent, right? People philosophize in the direction they want the conclusions to go, right? It's incredible how prevalent it is, right? And Hume was pointing this out 300 years ago, right? And it hasn't become better since then. It has only become worse, in my opinion, right? As far as I'm concerned, right? So, okay, please share, like, and subscribe, and consider a donation. Links below. And otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.